Well, hello there. This is Tamil, and today we're going to talk about blur filters in Clip Studio Paint. You can read the article down in the description, and let's just get started. I'm going to be using this image to showcase the blur filters in Clip Studio Paint because it has a little bit of everything, and it's going to be easy to see the differences. You go into the article, you can actually zoom in and see all of it side by side more than just skipping through the video. So let's just go into the filter gallery. You select the layer. In the blur, there's 6 different blur functions. It might seem like a lot, but actually you might as well just use 1 or 2 of them, and let's see what each one does. The first 2 are not my favorite because they work, but they don't work as strong as they should be for most cases, and there is no slider. So let's say I have the selected layer, have blur, and I click on it. It blurs it, but there's no slider that I can adjust to add more to it. And I actually have everything prepared, and you can see the differences between the two. And let's just turn on the blur, which is the normal. It's a little bit, and go into blur strong. It's a little bit more, but still not enough. Each time you want to blur, you want to click on it, go into filter and click on it again. Unless you want to set up an action for that, you can go and see a video on how to set up actions in Clip Studio Paint, but I don't think it's as convenient as it could be, and that is why I usually use Gaussian Blur, which is the most common blur you can find even in other softwares. And once you click on it, it's going to give you a big slider, a button for preview, and that's all you need. You basically increase the slider and it's going to blur it more. If you decrease the slider, it's going to blur it less. And depending on the situation, you want to blur more or less, it's really up to you. And this is slider at 30. You can really zoom in and see how it just combines the colors together really nicely. So I recommend using that one for most cases. Another one is motion blur. Basically, when your camera or the object moves really fast and the camera shutter speed, if you know anything about photography, shutter speed is for how long the camera opens up to catch the image. The longer it's open, the less it's going to be able to capture things that are in movement. And you can try it yourself. You can literally just run and take a picture and some of it will be blurry. And that is exactly what motion blur is doing. The functions of motion blur a little bit more complicated, but it's pretty easy to use. And strength will blur it more or less. The angle will determine in which way you want to blur the image. I really like that there are direction and mode, but in short, I don't think most people will be using these, and you can do one way, forward or backward, or both sides, and the mode is box or smooth. And if you go into the article, you can see kind of side by side. And I also have it saved up in here. So this is motion blur at 25 in smooth. And this is motion blur at 25 in box version. So let's see. This is box. This is smooth. Box, smooth. There's a little bit of difference. You can notice it, but it really depends on the painting you're doing or the effect you're doing. And there's no really right or wrong answer as to which you should be using. I just keep it at default, which is the box, I believe, and worked found for me. And another one is radial blur. It has specific use for it. If you use it, you're going to see that it's pretty much very similar to everything else, except there is a small red X, and you can actually touch it and move it around, and depending on where you place it, it's going to blur less of that specific middle, and everything else will be more in motion. And basically, it tries to create a circle around that particular part of the image, and it tries to blur everything else more, as if everything is going towards it. And it's really, really cool to use if you have like a very action-packed composition where someone was running towards the camera, and you can put the radial blur on their face, for example, and that will give you a really nice action-packed effect. So for this one, I put it right here, and you can see that it's blurring more of this compared to this part of the image. The last blur is called smooth. I don't think most people will find it useful. In short, it's made for smoothing the line art if it's way too crisp with anti-aliasing. And anti-aliasing, you can find that in most brushes. So let's say I have anti-aliasing at 0. And if I put the anti-aliasing at max, it's going to have a little bit hardness to it. And it's really hard to see. So let's just zoom in, and I made this specific part very, very crisp. And if I do smooth, I clicked on it, right? This is going to be the difference. It's really, really hard to see, but it's going to add some anti-aliasing. So how do you use blurs in the painting? And I made just a small little sketch that will help you think about your next painting, that you could use your blur filters in it. I made simple line, and it's pretty messy, and that's what I was going for. You can see that then I added the flat colors. This is where the interesting part comes in. You can actually use your line in different ways. And I like to, for example, set up a line to overlay. And you can see that it's, depending on the color under it, it's going to change the color for the line. So for example, this is like dark red. This is kind of like a green, and it just adds more variety to it, which I really like. And after that, you can duplicate that layer, and you can actually set it to overlay again, but you can use filter, blur, Gaussian blur. This will give you like this wispy effect. And it's pretty easy to achieve, but remember that if you do this, it's going to be a little bit hard to edit if you're going to paint on top of this to add hard edges. So let's just go into line, duplicate it, hide the below one, overlay, and then you duplicate it again, and then you do blur, Gaussian blur. And depending on how crisp you want or how blurry you want the image to feel like, now you can just play with sliders, maybe 50% or 80%. And you can also paint the layer. So for example, if I do a new layer, I do clipping mask to just affect the bottom one, and I do very bright green. Now it's going to add this effect. And it really depends where you're going with this and how you want your painting to feel. And obviously this is too strong, but that's why you can adjust it to a little bit less opacity. And I think it works in some cases pretty cool. And after I'm done with this, I wanted to add a little bit of glow to it, which I know it already has the glow, but you can actually make it a dark scene, like real quick. And the way I did it was just creating a new layer, and I picked like a very dark blue and set it to hard light. And depending on the situation, you just adjust opacity and saturation and just see what works best. But I don't want to focus that tutorial on this, and that's why I just pre-made everything. So let's say I wanted to add fireflies. And the simple way to do it is you get a regular brush, and as you sizing it down, you just paint a little bit. And the layer mode for this was actually color dodge. And you go into color dodge, and you pick any color you want that is going to be affecting the canvas. And you can use any brush as long as it has some opacity to it, like this. Now I can just add that. You know, it feels like a little bit too edges, like too many edges. You can see the transition. And that's why you can go into filter and Gaussian blur. Now you can just add more blur to it. And now it will feel more transitioning. So that's what I did here. I got a round brush, I added green, I added fireflies, and this is like a very, very hardcore version of this. And after that, I just blurred it, just like I showed you. And after this, you can actually go ahead and paint on top of this. And this is what I prefer, or how I sometimes work, is I do everything very wispy and airbrushy and very unfocused. And then after that, I go back to the painting, and now I can add more hard edges to it. So for example, I know the face is going to be reflecting some of the light from the fireflies, and I know this part is going to be a little bit darker, and the folds on the jeans are going to be affected a little bit more. Just like that, you can build on top of that, just layer by layer, and add more to your painting. And another thing that I want to show you is, obviously it's a skateboarder. So which means they are in motion. But it's really hard to see which way they're going or how they're going if there's no ground or there's no background. So a quick way to fix that, you can just add motion blur to the edges. This one I actually wanted to demonstrate because it's a little bit preparation. And let's see, I made a new layer. You go into layer, and in here you see merge visible to new layer. And now you have a separate thing that flattened everything. So I have the entire image right here. See? It copied everything. And now I want to do is filter, blur, and you do motion blur. You can do strength, or you can do angle. And I picked the angle that it's going to be where the skateboarding is falling. And I did both directions, and I did box. And it looks very, very messy, obviously, but what you do is you create a mask for this. So you create a mask. Now you want to Control A to select all, and you click delete or backspace, and now you don't have anything, right? And after this, you can go into white and just pick any brush that you want, something textured. And now you can come in and just add a little bit of motion blur to the edges of the character from where he's going. And it really depends on the effect or the brush you're going for, but I think something textured just a little bit will work pretty cool. So once you have that, you can either blur it a little bit more or add more to it by adding more maybe harsh lines like that, or blurry lines. It really depends on the effect you're going for, but I really like doing it that way with the mask, which means I can always come back to it and remove it if I don't like it. So once we've done that, we also have another effect, which is very, very commonly used in most cases for painting. And let's say I have the character and he's falling and there's no background, and I want to add more depth to it. And so this way you can just maybe create a bush in front of the character because maybe she's in a skate park or some sort of that environment. An easy way to do this, when the camera is very close to something, it's going to blur some of the foreground. So let's just create a small, very messy kind of bush in here that is going to be a little bit in front of her. So I made this, it's pretty simple, just for demonstration purposes, but I have that layer select, and I want to duplicate it with Command J or Control J, just in case. You hide it, and then you go into Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. Now we want that perfect effect to be enough so that it's blurred, but you still can tell that it's a bush, and it's not going to be feeling fixed. It's something like this maybe. Now we can just do a little darker because the foreground is usually a lot darker than the midground. And compensate, we're going to increase the saturation. And after that, we can just duplicate it, get even smaller. Maybe add another bush, just like that. And there you go. Now we have a bush in front of the character. They're in movement, and we used the wispy blurry lines, just like here. And now we can just keep rendering this until it's finished. A reminder, I think you should be doing all the effects at the very final stage so that you can actually see what the result will look like, because if you keep rendering it like that, sometimes, just sometimes, it's not the best idea because it's hard to come back to it and remove the blur because it's all permanent. So that's why I made the duplicate for every layer that I make before I create the filter. And I hope this was helpful. I just went over pretty much everything, but very lightly. And maybe if you have any ways that you can share or your techniques about blur, just let me know, write it in the comments. This was like a short tutorial specifically focusing on filter blur. Hopefully this was helpful, and happy painting!